Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's topic is dynamic seating. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to review this topic with me. It's one of those little niche areas of wheelchair seating that I'm very passionate about. I happen to work with a lot of clients who can benefit from this technology. My name is Michelle. I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area. And I've been working with assistive technology, including wheelchair seating and mobility, for a lot of years now. And again, this is an area that I work in quite a bit. So let's get started. In this webinar today, we're going to be defining dynamic seating. It's kind of a tricky term, and some people out there will use this term to mean different things. So it's important that we're clear on that. And then we're going to talk about how we can apply dynamic seating at the hips, at the legs, primarily the knees, and at the head when appropriate for the clients that we work with. So what is dynamic seating? Well, dynamic seating is movement that occurs within the seat and or the wheelchair frame in response to force from the client. The dynamic components, a spring or an elastomer, will absorb the force, and that in turn assists the client back to their starting position. We'll see some videos of this here in just a little bit. So imagine, perhaps even now, you're sitting in an office chair, and your office chair allows you to lean back. It moves when you stretch out or just lean on back. And some of that energy that you have taken to lean back in your office chair helps you to come back to upright. The back doesn't just fall behind you. It comes back again when you don't push against it any longer. This is similar to dynamic seating, except that this is available within wheelchair seating systems. This movement has various goals. Here's our primary goals. It allows movement of the client. You know, we all like to move, and some of our clients really seek out movement. Movement has a lot of benefits in and of itself. That movement diffuses force. So if a client is pushing with a lot of force, they have increased muscle tone, let's say. By allowing movement rather than the client pushing against a static surface, that force is diffused, it's reduced. This movement can protect the client from injury and protect the seating system, mounting hardware, the mobility base from being damaged and broken. Also, by allowing the client to move within a limited range, we can actually see improvements in postural control. So let's go into this in a little more detail. Again, we all like to move, at least I do, and we'll probably all wiggle around a little bit as we make our way through this webinar here today. Allowing movement within a wheelchair for a client who cannot otherwise move within their wheelchair, because lots of people within their wheelchair can scoot themselves around. But for clients who really can't move once they're positioned in their wheelchair, dynamic seating can provide movement that can increase sitting tolerance and compliance. So this person's more likely to remain in their seating system and tolerate that better. It provides vestibular input by just simply moving. We know that movement increases alertness and it decreases agitation, and that's very helpful for a lot of our clients as well. And movement for a lot of people will actually improve functioning as well. Finally, movement provides some active range of motion, even if it's in a limited range for our clients as well. Our second goal is to diffuse force. So again, let's say we're working with a client who can exert significant forces against their seating system within the wheelchair. By diffusing the force, by taking the wind out of their sails, so to speak, we're reducing active extension. We're breaking up that pattern. We're also reducing energy exertion. You know, I work with a lot of clients like Daniel, who's pictured here, who look like they're just fighting their system all day long, and they burn a tremendous amount of calories. Gaining weight is the issue. It's certainly never losing weight. By diffusing some of those forces, we can reduce that energy exertion. I've actually seen some clients who have gained some weight after having dynamic seating, and typically much needed weight. By diffusing this force, we can also further increase sitting tolerance and compliance, decrease agitation, and increase function. Now the client might have a chance to move outside of those patterns of movement generated by the muscle tone and actually be a little more functional. Our third general goal is to protect. First and foremost, we want to protect the client. If a client is exerting enough force to actually break components, wheelchair frames, pieces of the seating system, injury is very, very possible. I've worked with many clients, you may have as well, who break their headrest or head support routinely off of their wheelchair. If my client is exerting so much force that they are snapping their headrest off the chair, there's a very good chance that they're exerting enough force to create a concussion, or at least micro concussions. We have a lot of concern about micro concussions these days. It's a force that may not be quite as much as what's required to technically qualify as a concussion, but if these micro concussions are happening over and over and over, there's still evidence that this is causing a challenge to the brain. Other injuries can occur as well. We also want to protect the seating system, mounting hardware, and the mobility base. I see a lot of breakage in those areas, especially with clients who have a lot of tone or large forceful movements. That breakage is a problem in all sorts of ways. This is Daniel again. If he breaks something off on his chair, he may not be able to use his chair until it's repaired. That could be some period of time. That might mean that he's in bed. A lot of consequences for him to stay in bed. He may not be able to go to school or other activities. And someone like me has to keep writing letters of medical necessity and hoping that the funding source will continue to replace components on his chair. And fourth, by providing movement against a light degree of force, the force of a dynamic component, such as a spring or an elastomer, strength may build, and this can lead to improved trunk and head control. Now, the primary purpose of providing dynamic seating is not to help our clients work out or to meet our therapy goals. We use therapy for that, but it can be a nice side effect, so to speak, of using dynamic seating to meet our clients' other needs. Now, static seating is what we're most likely to see with our clients. This is seating that supports the client, but it doesn't move. If the client's moving, they're moving in relation to the seat. That means they perhaps are losing their ideal posture and may not be able to recover that. And it can lead to shear forces as the client's body is moving across the surfaces of the seating system. It can lead to some friction and shear. Static seating is sometimes required. It might be that if there's movement at the legs, for example, that the foot might be injured, might catch on something because it's moving outward away from the body along with the dynamic seating component. It might be that the client needs to have a very stable position in order for them to be functional. And perhaps if they are using a switch, like this young man here by the side of his head, if his seating system moves, he might lose alignment with that switch. So there are times where static seating may be required. I am finding in my own practice that most of my clients who I think can benefit from dynamic seating are doing so, and I'm not finding very many of these exceptions. Dynamic product options tend to fall into two general categories. The first category is designed to prevent breakage, the frame, the seating system, etc., by diffusing force. And there's not often a lot of movement in these products. There's not as many of these products on the market either. But these are appropriate for clients that maybe don't have a lot of range of motion to move along with the dynamic component, or they don't tolerate that movement. In the second category, we have options that provide actual movement, more movement of the client to diffuse force and reduce tone, provide that more active movement for that increased sitting tolerance, vestibular input, increased alertness, decreased agitation, etc. So just know that some of these products do not move very much, and the ones that don't move much are mostly designed to prevent breakage. The components that move a little more do prevent breakage, but also provide the advantages of movement for the client. There are a lot of seating products that are available, more than we used to have by a long shot. It is very different within the United States and internationally. Internationally, many of our options are integrated systems where you purchase a wheelchair that already incorporates dynamic components. In the United States, our options are primarily modular, where something is ordered that can be retrofitted to the wheelchair and provide movement in one or multiple areas. It's important that the assessment is completed by a team who specializes in seating and mobility, and that includes the supplier as well. It should be a supplier who has their ATP credential, Assistive Technology Professional through RESNA, who has the experience to explore dynamic seating and who can trial this equipment with the client if possible. All right, so we're going to move into providing dynamic movement at specific areas of the body. The three main areas where dynamic movement is provided are at the hips, the knees, and the neck. So we're going to go through kind of some of the advantages and disadvantages of providing this movement and just give some examples of some of the products that are out there. And I promise we'll have a video soon because that will certainly make this a lot clearer as we discuss this. Now, providing movement at the pelvis can be advantageous for many of our clients. If we don't allow any movement at the pelvis, if that movement is blocked by a more static seating system, that client is still attempting to extend at the hips. And so that force is transferred to wherever it can go. So there's generalized extension throughout the body, even if it starts at the hips. It could be at the knees, the ankles, the neck, wherever we see that extension overflowing from the hips. By providing movement at the hips instead of blocking this movement, we can often reduce that overall extension because we're diffusing that instead of allowing it to transfer to other areas of the body. Also, by allowing some movement at the hips, we're providing some weight shifts. Now, we're not offloading areas completely, but we are providing some change in position, and that can also help with pressure relief and comfort. Now, there are some disadvantages to providing movement at the pelvis, and this is where the design of dynamic components is very important to address these concerns. This is Spencer, and he's actually in a dynamic seating system. You can see on the right, he's sitting down. On the left, he is excited, and he is basically standing up in his dynamic system. So it is extending for him at the hips and at the knees in this case. It's important that if he assumes this extended position and then comes back down to a seated position, that the pelvis returned to neutral. What happens for a lot of our clients who have a static system is if they attempt to extend, and they perhaps will stand up in their chair whether the seat moves with them or not, when they sit back down, their pelvis is often in a posterior pelvic tilt. And that's not the position that we want. Some dynamic components that allow movement at the hips also allow the client to assume a posterior pelvic tilt. So the design is really important to combat that from happening. For some clients, if we allow movement of the pelvis, the client is going to pull into a destructive posture, a posture that we don't want them to be in, that has negative consequences to them. Some clients, if they move into that more open seat to back angle, that posterior pelvic tilt, even if it's temporary until the dynamic seating returns them to neutral, tend to have increased extension or spasming. And the client may not be able to return to neutral. And this is one of the reasons it's very important to try this stuff to see how your client responds to it, and to pay attention to the design of the back to see if there's features built in to prevent this from occurring. So how do we provide this open seat to back angle, this movement at the hips? Well, we provide a dynamic back. So in this case, there's movement that occurs only at the back of the seating system. It can be combined with other dynamic options to provide movement at the knees or the neck. But let's look at a few examples of dynamic backs. This is the Miller's dynamic backrest interface, and it extends at the level of the biangular back. So let me find my little arrow here. This back here is called a linear back because it's flat. But right in the middle of it, there's this line here. It's called a biangular back because we have two different angles. This lower portion goes to about the top of the pelvis and tends to be a little more of a closed angle between this lower back and the seat of the seating system. This upper portion tends to extend a little bit beyond that. This particular back bends or extends at this biangular joint, and that's the dynamic portion of it. And I know I have a little note here that we have a video. I had so many videos that we went over our limit of videos, so we're going to see a video soon of a dynamic back, but unfortunately not this one here. But it moves here at this biangular joint. The purpose of that is to try to keep the pelvis from sliding into a posterior tilt by moving the pivot point higher up. Another option is the seating dynamics dynamic back. While the Miller's dynamic back uses hydraulics, this particular one uses these elastomers, and there's different colors here that each represent a different amount of resistance. It locks out as needed for, say, transportation, and it moves when unlocked. So we're going, whoops, here we go. We're going to watch a video of this. So you can see that movement, and that movement is right at that little polymer there, or elastomer, that's providing the movement of the back. Let's watch another video of Daniel using this dynamic back.
He's like, 9 more months. I just turn like, shut up. Shut up.
Just kind of waiting to the countdown.
Now Daniel here
Now when I take strike break on, the clubs are 4 ounces away.
very excited.
Hasn't reached just yet.
to what that moment might be like.
There's this thing about catharsis, though. It needs to be absolute. It needs to take all your emotions
and when he relaxes, he comes back down to a nice neutral point. And part of the reason for that is because, get my pointer here again, the pivot point on this is high. It's quite a ways above the seat rail, and again, that's an attempt to keep the pelvis in a neutral position when the client returns to upright. Another dynamic back option is from Sunrise Medical, and it's available on their Quickie manual wheelchairs, at least some of the Quickie chairs. It also has little elastomers here. They do tend to sit rather low, and so there's a little more shear force involved when the client moves, and it's easier for the client to lose the position of the pelvis. And they provide 4 different levels of resistance. Okay, so we're going to take a break here for just a second and see if anyone has any questions or comments at this point. Feel free to type those in at any time during the webinar, and we'll stop and take those periodically. So while people are typing, again, we've talked some about just what is dynamic seating, what are the goals of dynamic seating, and then what are the pros and cons of providing dynamic seating at the hips using a dynamic back. And Amy has asked, will this presentation be available to print off in the future? Yes, everyone will be receiving a PDF of this PowerPoint. I believe at the end of the webinar, you'll receive an email. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so we're going to press forward. If you're typing, keep typing, and I'll come back and get your questions. All right. Well, we have a couple questions there. Let's go back to those questions here. We have one question, do all dynamic systems need to be locked during driving? It is recommended that a dynamic back be locked during transportation. The dynamic footrests really don't lock, neither do most of the dynamic head supports, but the backs do. So typically those are locked during transport. And then unlocked when you get where you're going, that's a real problem. Sometimes they don't get released and the client can't move. Claire has mentioned that she's been told that these sorts of things are not durable. What are the thoughts? Good question. You know, durability is a big issue, and it's often one that I bring up when talking about dynamic seating. We're a little limited on time today to go into a lot of detail, but I would like to direct you to a blog that I wrote on that topic about durability and dynamic seating. When we get to the end of the webinar, I have some resources listed for you, including where you can read those blogs, and there is one that's just on this topic of durability. It's a very important topic because we already have clients that are breaking things on their chair, and these moving components have to be able to withstand a high amount of force and move, which means they have to be stronger than the original components. So durability is a big deal. Let's see, and the person who had asked about driving was clarifying when you're in a car or a van. Yes, so that's when you would want to lock the dynamic components. And Derek has asked, do any of the major manufacturers offer an integrated dynamic back with an elevated pivot point? The modular ones certainly do. I'd have to take a look. I'm familiar with the integrated systems, but since I don't use them, they're not available here in the United States where I am. You'd have to check with that individual manufacturer. All right, so we're going to move on, and then I will continue answering questions at our next little break here. So let's talk about dynamic seating at the lower extremities. There are a lot of clients that use wheelchair seating that will not tolerate having their feet restrained. It's very common for us to strap down people's feet for all sorts of reasons. It might be to protect the feet or to provide stability for the client. Sometimes by allowing movement at the knees or the lower extremity in general, we might find that a client will tolerate having their feet strapped to that foot plate better. And if we're using, dynamic movement at the legs, it's critical that we strap those feet, attach those feet to the foot plate. Otherwise, the client will extend and their feet will simply slip right off of the foot plate itself. If we limit lower extremity movement, rather than letting someone just move their legs wherever their tone or movement patterns might take them, if we limit that movement to within the movement parameters of the dynamic component, we may protect the feet from injury as well. But keep in mind that restricting the feet in any way might usually will prevent independent transfers. And some clients are still just not going to put up with having their feet restrained. So we have a number of product options. Again, there are dynamic components, usually that replace the current footrest hangers. The movement that's possible and varies from product to product includes knee extension, where we are increasing the angle at the knee, we're straightening it out. A telescoping feature where the foot plate moves downward towards the floor, and plantar and dorsiflexion movement at the ankles. You can have all three of those or perhaps just one. The telescoping and knee extension movements tend to go together. It allows for that normal arc of movement that happens at the leg. Providing movement at the knee is really much more complicated than at the back because we do have these multiple planes of movement. So there are a few options out there for dynamic footrest. Again, in the United States, we have these modular options. Miller's has the dynamic articulating footrest hanger. They also have a few related new products. They have different levels of resistance and utilize a gas spring. This telescopes downward and elevates. Go. Hey, you can tell you've done that before. We then have seating dynamics, which also has a dynamic footrest. This one telescopes about 1.5 inches downward and then has optional knee extension up to 30 degrees and optional dorsiplantarflexion about 10 degrees in each direction. It has different springs for the telescoping feature to vary the amount of resistance, and then it has these, let me get my little arrow again, has these little elastomers in the knee, and there's 2 levels of resistance available there for knee extension. Let's take a look at a video of that.
So, Dad, has Spencer been to the fire station lately?
Wait for it. This is Spencer.
Any ride-alongs?
Hanging out.
Helping you put out the flames? Yeah, that time, because before it was more the left. But I think that's, again, it's cool that he can
some of our
move them
older integrated systems that are no longer available in the United States used to utilize a foot board, and sometimes these only responded if a client pushed fairly equally with both sides of their body. But some of our clients, most of my clients, use a combination, or not really a combination, they have various tone on either side of the body. So you could see here that Spencer sometimes pushes more with one side of his body than the other. Okay, let's go back to questions because this group always has a lot of good questions here. Dallas has asked, have these dynamic options been well tested? Do they tolerate high tone? Well, Dallas, the trick there is there hasn't been very much testing yet, a little bit, and some of these tend to be more durable than others. I do find that many of these systems work very, very well and tolerate high tone. I work with lots of clients who routinely broke their wheelchairs or specific components and have not yet broken anything since we switched over to dynamic option. So again, kind of gets back to the durability. Let's see. Derek has clarified his question about pivot points on integrated dynamic back systems versus aftermarket systems. Derek, I find that the Miller's biangular dynamic back, because they have several of them, has a higher pivot point, but you are limited to use a linear biangular back, which is kind of an older style back now. The Seating Dynamics, I like where their pivot point is as well. Eileen has said, can the Leggero Reach stroller be retrofit with dynamic components? Leggero offers a stroller, the Dyno, that has some dynamic components on it, especially at the back. There's a little bit of movement forward with the feet. So you cannot, as far as I know, retrofit the Reach, but I would encourage you to look at the Dyno if you're looking at the Leggero stroller. And hi, Judy. Judy has said, Seating Dynamics products are very durable. Several of my clients use the back mechanism and have for years, so thank you for that input. And Claire is saying thank you for a previous answer and saying my son is one of those who breaks things related to being stronger than the original components. Would that just cause breakage somewhat place down the line? If this is addressed in your blog, I'll read that. So, Claire, that's a good question. If something is more durable, does that mean the force goes somewhere else and something breaks? That hasn't been my personal experience. Really, this moving component is what's taking the force and absorbing it. But again, durability of that component is quite critical. And some of these components, in my personal experience, have been more durable than others. We have another question. What if you have a very low-tone client, but who doesn't like to wear a chest harness? He is constantly flopping to the left-right. I'm concerned about scoliosis. Actually, if just because we have a lot of questions, I'm going to hold that question for now. The title there is AT Team. And if we, because that's not as related to dynamic seating, but I'd be happy to follow up with you after the webinar. And let's see, Derek has asked, what about clients who incorporate an element of ER with extension? I can't seem to prevent loosening as the Miller's option is round on round, allows for rotation, help, and thanks. Derek, if you could clarify what you mean by ER, I want to make sure I understand what you are referring to. I think you're referring to external rotation, but I want to make sure. And then, oh, Claire, thank you for your comment about the videos and audio. Amy wants to know, are these relatively new options? A lot of these, some of the options have been around for a while, particularly the Miller's options. Some of the others are newer, variety there. We have a question about funding, and that's perfect because that's our next slide. All right, can I get this stuff paid for? Yes, of course it depends on the funding source, but I have had very good success getting dynamic seating funded through state Medicaid. Now I'm in Colorado, and each state's different, but I know of other colleagues who have had success in other states and through private insurance. Very different situation with Medicare always, and that is more challenging. Documentation is really, really critical. So I have a resource for you on the Seating Dynamics website. Under resources, under downloadable information, is some sample medical justification wording that you can use. that can be helpful in terms of how to justify dynamic seating at the hips, at the knees, at the neck. All the wording is there. You can customize it to meet the needs of your client. But I find that what's often lacking is adequate documentation. Now, most funding sources are just not familiar with dynamic seating unless they've been getting a lot of requests for it. So this is something completely new to them. So it's very important that it's being explained well in our documentation and then justified for that individual in order for it to be funded. If you have some questions I haven't answered yet, don't worry, we're going to try to get those at the end. So next we move on to dynamic seating at the head, which really involves neck movement. Providing movement at the neck can absorb forces there. That protects the neck and protects the brain. Again, there are clients out there that it doesn't matter how big they are. Taylor here is not a big guy. He doesn't weigh a lot, but he can break his head support clean off his wheelchair. Dynamic components at the neck can help absorb those forces so that we're protecting the cervical area, protecting the brain from those impacts and that sustained force. We can see reduced breakage of the head support mounting hardware and reduce loss of alignment of the head support. You know, I have a lot of people, I do a lot of head positioning. A lot of folks will say, gosh, that head support moves out of the way all the time, moves out of position. Well, a lot of times it's because the client is exerting huge forces against it. And I find that by providing some dynamic tone reduction in that area, that the head support suddenly maintains its alignment. So we're trying to diffuse that force. Now there's some disadvantages to allowing movement at the neck. If there's too much movement rearward, for a lot of our clients that can really lead to postural insecurity, and it can even trigger some reflexive responses. So it's something to really be cautious of and decide how much movement is applicable for this particular client. Now there's a number of options out there. I'm going to show you just a handful of them. This is the Miller's Dynamic Headrest Horizontal Adjustment Bar. You see there's a spring there. It is shrouded typically to help protect hair. One of the difficulties with this particular dynamic option when we have dynamic components behind the head is we do deal with hair, and so protecting these mechanisms so that hair is pulled is very, very important. This moves posteriorly about 2 inches. And again, sorry, we had a video of this in here, but I had so many videos that we had to remove that, and I forgot to take that wording out. This is the Seating Dynamics dynamic headrest. They actually have 2 different kinds, the single axis and multi-axis. Single axis moves straight back about 10 degrees, and you can change the resistance by changing these little elastomers in here. So if you don't want the client to move back quite as far, you can make those a little firmer. The multi-axis moves in some rotation, and what's nice about that is that many of our clients do not move their head directly rearward. There's some rotation when they extend. Some of the systems on the market that provide dynamic movement at the neck only capture movement in a bidirectional MEMS, meaning straight anterior, straight posterior, and don't capture rotation well. They might jam. Now with that said, I don't order the multi-axis very often. I find that the single axis, even if my client is only touching one side of it, will still respond quite nicely. The mechanism is way down here and it's well shrouded to help protect hair. Let's watch a video of this one. So you get a sense of that movement there. for this particular person. The amount of force is going to vary depending on how many links you have. If the head support is sitting higher up, there's a little more leverage. This is from Stealth Products, and it's called the Tone Deflector. Looks like a little hockey puck, and it sits between the head pad and the mounting hardware. It moves about 10 degrees in any direction. I use this particular product a great deal. I like it because for clients I work with who are routinely breaking equipment, this has prevented that from occurring. I have not had any client break this in over 10 years. It also doesn't move a lot because as much as I love movement, I love dynamic seating, most of my clients will not tolerate very much movement at the neck. And so I use this to provide some of that force diffusion to protect the hardware from getting out of alignment and breaking, but not providing a huge amount of movement. This is from Symmetric Designs, and it's called the Axion Rotary Interface, and it allows the client to rotate their head side to side. It's often used with a head support that they also offer called the Savant with a forehead strap. And this would be for a client who has very limited head control, but still providing a way of turning the head. If you don't keep your head in contact with the pad, it won't turn with you. And then finally, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this particular device here today. This is the head pod. That little visor is just for decoration. There are some straps around this child's head that are connected to the vertical strap that holds the head upright and allows the client to move their head side to side and maybe into a little flexion and extension. And this is really used often for therapeutic reasons to improve head control, but it is also within this dynamic options for the head. All right, let's get back to some questions, and we're going to get into some case studies here in a moment. All right, so AT team had asked how to justify these for insurance. So again, I would recommend that you check out those sample medical wording document that's available on the Seeing Dynamics website. Oh yes, Derek had mentioned before a client that had external rotation of the lower leg as they extend. So some clients, as they extend, the feet turn outward, and sometimes that's even due to tibial torsion. In that case, it is possible on the Seating Dynamics dynamic footrest to place the foot plates in that position so that we're respecting that loss of range and keep the clients in that position as they extend. I hope that is what you were getting at there with your question. We have another question. Thoughts on the use of static pelvic stabilizers with dynamic backs? Do they tend to break with aggressive spinal extension? If you are referring to a subaceous bar, I have not used one yet with a dynamic back. I don't think I would, because you have this rigid bar that needs to be in a very specific alignment to the pelvis, and if the pelvis is rocking rearward during dynamic movement, I think there's just too much movement going on there. I would switch to a different type of pelvic support. That's a good question. Susan, we've had very bad luck with this brand headrest, could not keep them adjusted. I'm sorry, Susan, I didn't see exactly when you typed that in. If you could let me know which headrest that might be that you're having trouble with keeping them adjusted, that would be great. Bridget has said, I'm fairly new to this, but do you often require head and back rest dynamic seating together for high tone management, extensor thrust diffusion? We're going to touch that on just a second. Derek, I'm glad I answered your question. And Dallas just said, I have several clients that prefer a head position extremely offset to one side. Despite several trials of static headrest, they still manage to get around the hardware. Are there dynamic options for clients who prefer this head position that would encourage a more neutral position? Well, Dallas, that's kind of a loaded question. It's pretty complicated there. When you say offset to one side, do you mind clarifying whether you mean that the head is not in midline or whether you mean the client is rotating their head? That would be, well, you said correct. I gave you two options there. They're not in midline. Thank you so much, Dallas. You're a very fast typer. So if someone's not in midline, basically you can attach that head support offset on one side. So you just take that head support and instead of mounting it in midline, you mount it midline to the client's head. Then you can use the dynamic supports from there. And I have done that with some good success. Of course, it depends on where the client's movement is being pulled. Okay, and Susan has clarified, seating dynamics headrest, though we have had good luck with their backrest. Oh, okay, so you've had difficulty keeping the seating dynamics headrest adjusted. That's interesting because actually I have found that the hardware, the mounting hardware that Seating Dynamics uses is probably the most, well, let me think how to describe that, the least likely to lose its position. They have a very intense clamping system there. So it might be something to follow up with Seating Dynamics because actually they hold their position probably better than any headrest on the market. So there might be a problem with the setup that you have. I would definitely give them a call. Thanks, Susan. All right, someone had asked about using these together, and these components can be used in combination. It depends on your client and where you see the movement, but I frequently do combine these technologies. Let's take a look at an example. So there you could see that you can absolutely combine movement at the back, at the footrest, and at the head, depending on what the client's needs are. So we're going to wrap up with a case study and also make sure that we're getting everyone's questions in here as well. So Philip is an adult with developmental disabilities who really seeks out movement, and he is using a tilt and space wheelchair with a linear seating system.
But this is he's got chunks out of his tires.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's right. That's a good song.
You know, we do disc brakes on the tilt now.
So as you can see, Philip really likes to rock and roll. He moves and moves and moves. He moves with such force that his wheelchair will actually move across the room and is at risk of tipping over. So to prevent this from occurring, his team locks the wheels to keep it from rolling across the room. The challenge then is he exerts so much force that if you look careful, and it's a little hard to see on these pictures, all around his wheel, he has chunks of the tire that are missing because he's broken them off around the wheel lock each time he is locked into position. That's how much force he's using. He's using a lot more force than it may look like on that video. Now, because of all this movement, Philip's team actually had recommended some dynamic components, and this is where durability becomes important. They had recommended a dynamic back here, and this is by Quickie. It's their dynamic back, but he moved it with such force that the elastomers that usually are in here that absorb that force kept wearing out. And so the supplier would continually replace these and finally resorted to putting another manufacturer's elastomers in there. They happen to put Seating Dynamics elastomers in there. The problem then is now we have an elastomer that was not designed for this particular dynamic back. Well, in the meantime, Philip wore things out so much in this dynamic component here that he is rocking, as we saw in that video, but this elastomer isn't even activating. It's not compressing at all. The movement you're seeing is that he has worn all the holes within this dynamic component from round holes, which a bolt goes through, to now an oval. And because of that, this entire mechanism has quite a bit of movement in it, but not where it should be, compressing the elastomer. And the whole thing was at grave risk of basically exploding.
Dynamic.
Well, if they're not using our product, they're not going to use the tone deflector.
Tone is very, very high too. Very high. Yeah. Tone.
There you go. We can see in that video, and I'll go back to that in a second, Philip also tends to bang his head against the head support. Now, it doesn't look like he's using a lot of force, but he is. He has two mounts behind this pad holding it onto the chair because he's broken off so many of these. And he's worn the hair off of the back of his head by this constant friction between his head and...
Well, if they're not using our product, they're not going to use the tone
Take another look.
Tone is very, very high too. Very high. Yeah. Tone.
So we recommended for Philip a Seating Dynamics dynamic rocker back interface because it tends to be more durable than the one he was using, and it could be locked out for transport, and that was something that needed to occur where he was at as well. And it provided that movement he was so desperately looking for. We also recommended the dynamic head support hardware from Seating Dynamics as well, to allow for his movement and to diffuse these forces he was using, banging against the head support surface. So let's take a look at Philip with his new dynamic components.
Oh, he loves it.
Here's Philip rocking away.
Wrinkle. Like an old man, a wrinkle. He's fine.
Which has saved the chair from breaking down.
Yes.
We have moving components now.
Yes. He has it here too. He has.
Now, I spoke to Philip's therapist recently. Philip lives in Delaware, actually, and she reports that he's doing really well with these new components. He really enjoys the movement. There hasn't been any damage to the wheelchair, and they're hoping that will continue because this was a chronic problem for him. He is moving the dynamic footrest, but just not in this particular clip. And in this clip, he had just received the components, and the head support was actually a little too far behind him. They've since moved it forward, and that allows him to be in more appropriate alignment, and he is moving that as well. All right, let's take some more questions here. Derek has said one of the problems with the Sunrise offering is you cannot change the recline angle to match existing hip flexion limitations as you can with static canes. Keen to explore the Seating Dynamics option as I noticed recline angle adjustment. Yeah, boy, that's a really good point, Derek. You can certainly change the angle, the seat to back angle, the back cane to seat rail angle on the Seating Dynamics system. And that's really important because depending on our clients' postural needs, their range of motion in those hip flexors, that's something we often need to change, particularly in people who are using this sort of technology. And so that's an excellent point. When we're looking at features of all these various components, it's always nice to have more than one option because one option might best meet our client's needs. All right, and Claire has asked, can you use dynamic components on power chairs? You can, not every power chair out there. Each of these various components are compatible with certain chairs. For example, the Sunrise Medical dynamic components are compatible with some of the Quickie wheelchairs, but not other chairs. Whereas Miller's or Seating Dynamics is designed to go on multiple wheelchairs. On the Seating Dynamics website, there's actually a list of compatible chairs, manual and power. And we have 2 blogs on the topic of power wheelchairs and using dynamic components. And I think the second one was literally just posted today, so I would look at that. And key mobility, Claire has asked about that. Key mobility I know is compatible with seeing dynamic components. I'm not sure about Miller's. It probably would be with Miller's as well. Okay. We're going to touch on briefly this last case study here. This is Eddie. He is a teenager with cerebral palsy and seizures, and he has very strong extension and a history of equipment breakage. He had a linear seating system with this wood base here and in a tilt and space chair. He tends to lean way forward and then throw himself back, and he has broken this base underneath the laterals. He's broken laterals off. He's bruised himself on these components. So he's injuring himself. He is injuring or breaking the seating system. Since the seating system didn't move in response to Eddie's movement and force, he would extend against it, and as those of us know who work with people who have increased muscle tone, when there's a static surface that tone goes against, people tend to increase that tone further. So this was taking up a lot of his energy and taking away his functional ability. So he now has a dynamic back. And since he has had this dynamic back, and he's had this for several years now, he has had no more broken components, which is great. And his movement overall has reduced. And this is something I've seen a lot in dynamic seating, is clients who are moving and fighting and exerting against their seating systems all the time. Once they have a dynamic system, will often move quite a bit for a few months. But then it looks like they're not moving very much. They still are, but they know that they can move, and there seems to be less movement because of that. So it's interesting how that has worked. If you are working with someone using dynamic seating and think, gee, I wonder if they're still using it, just try to lock it out, and you'll see that movement come right back. I think a lot of clients are moving just enough to see how they're doing. This is what his mom says. When he first got the dynamic back, he rocked all the time. He doesn't move as much now. I think it is because he knows he can if he needs to. Eddie went through a kid cart, an adaptive stroller when he was very small, moved to a Zippy Iris, and then finally a PDG Stellar, which is a very durable manual chair because he was braking so much. Eventually ended up with a semi-custom contoured back, the Ride Designs back. And he's now been using a dynamic back for about 2 years. His mom says that because the dynamic back provides the movement that he needs, he no longer leans forward and throws himself back. Instead, he just rocks with the back movement. And rather than standing in the chair when he's upset, the back moves and Eddie doesn't lose his posture. There's definitely less force to his extension. And I love this one. He enjoys life more now. Let's watch a video of Eddie and then we'll wrap it up.
And with the official decision here is Bruce Butler. Ladies and gentlemen, referee Dan Bergliano's going to stop this contest at 4 minutes, 18 seconds. Declared the winner by
Okay, so we have just a couple minutes here, so if you have more questions, feel free to type those in, and as people are doing so, I want to make sure that you have some resources. Again, on the Seating Dynamics website, under resources, there's a list of upcoming and past courses and webinars. There are a large amount of blogs on a variety of topics that you can peruse, and they're listed by category. There's also a lot of resources under downloadable information. So feel free to check that out if you're looking for more information on this topic. And we did cover a huge amount of information here, so let's just review real quick. Dynamic seating can either allow movement of the client within the seating system or provide movement of the seating component and or frame. That can protect the seat and frame from damage by diffusing the force, protect the client from undue forces, and reduce tone and posturing by diffusing force, and provide active movement. I want to thank everyone very much for your time. I know everyone's super busy, and make sure you have my contact info. I know some of you need to leave right at the top of the hour, so that is fine. And for those of you who can stay on for a few more minutes, I'll be happy to take a few questions. We can stay on for just a few minutes here. Let's see. So Claire had asked about dynamic components on power chairs. Again, there's a blog on that. And Susan has asked, is it possible to use dynamic components with molded backs? There's a blog on that too. I write a lot of blogs about dynamic seating, so that's also on the Seating Dynamics website. It is possible to use a dynamic back with a molded back, mostly because the dynamic backs that are available, most of them do not move that much. So I find that if someone only moves about 10, 15 degrees, that there's not enough shear to cause an issue with a molded back. If anything, I find my clients who do not have dynamic seating but need it, if they have a molded back, they're moving within the molded back contours because they're extending so much. And I find that some of my clients actually have less shear with the molded back when we add the dynamic component. Vincent has said, I have a client who destroyed an Invacare Solera and a Stellar chair. Wow. He is now in another Solera with dynamic seat back, footrest, and front forks, as well as hub lock brake system, since he was also destroying tires with the other brake system. Wow, so that was a client who was obviously really beating up their equipment. Vincent, let me know if, since he's had the dynamic components, if the breakage is still an issue. Hopefully it is not anymore. But obviously that's a really compelling justification for a lot of this equipment, is ultimately saving money for the funding source by not replacing equipment constantly. Derek says, the process of ordering dynamic leg rests from Seating Dynamics seems really complicated. Any advice? My main advice on that is I would call up Ted. Ted Ruckstuhl will help you on the phone with ordering those leg rests, and he probably would have some good suggestions for you as well. He knows all that in and out and does those quotes all the time. Jacques has said, if patient uses feet to propel, would dynamic seating still be appropriate? It could be. It would be something that I would want to see them try first with that foot propulsion. You wouldn't use, obviously, dynamic footrest, but perhaps a dynamic back. I actually have a colleague who has a client who self-propels with their arms and found that their self-propulsion was more efficient using a dynamic back. I think it makes sense. They could kind of lean back, use that force to help them with their self-propulsion. Of course, that's very different than propelling with the feet. I would caution you, too, is if you have a client that's using foot propulsion, I'm not a big fan personally of foot propulsion. It's really hard to use foot propulsion efficiently. It just pulls the pelvis forward, and it's hard to use for long distances. If that is not adequately meeting your client's needs, it might be appropriate to consider power mobility. And Jacques also says the patient has ripped off footrest several times because he extends so much. You know, if this is the same client and a patient is using so much extension as to knock those footrest hangers off, then foot propulsion doesn't seem to probably be their best bet. I doubt if they have good control over their legs, and it might be time to look at something else. And then finally, Jack also says, the problem, I need to mount a switch on the foot plate to activate the device. Again, if somebody is pushing against the foot plate with so much force that they're breaking it, it's hard to imagine they'd have good switch, good ability to use a switch in that location because they're just simply using too much force. Release would be very difficult. Might be appropriate to look at another switch site. But with that said, of course, I have very little information, but just some things to think about. Vincent, who mentioned his client who's broken just about everything, says that breakage is no longer an issue. Also, the client has matured and settled down. Great. So awesome success story on dynamic seating. So that is terrific. And then finally, Lisa has said, what do you suggest for a client who has trunk, pelvic extension, and rotation posturing? In terms of dynamic seating, I think a lot of our clients who extend also tend to rotate. So it's important to address the rotation within the seating system. That's often done with anterior support, and still let the client move posteriorly using a dynamic back. There really isn't a product on the market right now that addresses trunk rotation dynamically. There was one for a short time, but it's not available right now. So that's what my general suggestion would be, is anterior support to try to control that trunk rotation, and then consider a dynamic back. Well, again, thank you, everyone, for all this wonderful discussion. This group always has a great deal of questions and comments, and I really appreciate that.